Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So, welcome those of you who are new. And in this class, we're studying the Gospel of John. As you can see on the title page, we started chapter 18 last week. And we'll be continuing tonight from verse 7 of chapter 18. Every week I begin with a brief general introduction just to remind people of what the document is that we're studying. The Gospel according to John is essentially a biography of Jesus. It's a story of the life of Jesus. And there are four such documents in our Bible: the Gospel according to Matthew, the Gospel according to Luke, the Gospel according to Mark, the Gospel according to John, and we're studying one of those, the Gospel according to John. One of the things that we notice is that these four Gospels talk about the same subjects, and while they don't ever contradict one another, they don't always say the same things. So each author chooses to emphasize certain things and therefore not to emphasize certain other things. So occasionally as we see what John says, we take a look and see at the additional information that Matthew, Mark, and Luke might have added. The Gospel according to John is not the only book in the Bible thought to have been written by or under the authority of the Apostle John. There are four others: the Revelation of John, and three little books that look like letters called 1, 2, 3 John. Totally 5 books in the Bible, which are sometimes called the Johannan books, books written by John. And all of the books in the New Testament, including the 5 Johannan books, were written in Greek originally and have since been translated into many other languages, including Japanese and English, which we use in this class. Usually it's not so difficult to understand what the original author meant to say by just looking at the translation. Occasionally it is difficult because we're reading a book that was written, first of all, in a different language, in Greek. In the early months of this study, I used to begin every week with a very thorough review. Now it's impossible because we're 18 chapters in. The review would take up the whole class. And so the only thing I can do by way of review really is to show this simple outline and very briefly remind everybody what's in John's Gospel. John's Gospel begins with an 18-verse prologue, or introduction, which is very important to the Gospel. That's where John reminds us that the one who would become Jesus was with God in the beginning. And then in the middle of chapter 1 and continuing until the end of chapter 12, John gives a summary of Jesus' public ministry. That covers the period of Jesus' life between the time he was about 30 years old and he was introduced to Israel by John the Baptist down by the Jordan River. And then Jesus traveled about around Jerusalem and Judea, up through Samaria, Galilee, and back down again to Jerusalem, where he ended his earthly ministry. Those chapters there between the middle of chapter 1 and the end of chapter 12 are Jesus' public ministry. And if you've been here with us then studying Jesus' public ministry, some of the things that you would remember from that are that Jesus performed many miraculous signs. There were 7 that John really featured in order to try to help his readers understand the divine power of Jesus. Jesus did things that nobody could ever have done except for one man who was also God, the Son of God. Also, we saw Jesus teaching. Jesus taught many important things, but the most important things Jesus taught were about himself, that he was the one sent from the one true God, that he was the one way to life, that he was the one way to the Father. So by the time we got to the end of chapter 12, we would have seen, through miracles and signs and through teaching, much of who Jesus was. And one of the interesting things is that despite all of that, and despite the fact that Jesus did all of those amazing things for 3.5 years, all over Palestine, at the end of chapter 12, he has only 12 disciples with him, and one of those we know will betray him, Judas. And so that's one of the things John helps us to see, that the time really hadn't come yet for people to understand and to follow Jesus in large numbers. During his earthly ministry, very few people, in fact, were attracted to him. Most turned away. The next major section of the Gospel according to John, which we finished now studying in this class also, chapters 13 through 17, were all spent in a room where Jesus and his, at first 12 disciples, but then Judas went out in chapter 13, and then only 11 disciples and Jesus spent time together in a room. And there Jesus' teaching was different and more intimate because he was speaking to the people who had kept his word, his disciples, the ones who would go out and build the church. And he knew that they needed to be prepared for what was about to happen, that is his death, his crucifixion, his resurrection, and so forth, for the ministry that they would have to go forward with after he had returned to be with the Father. And so those chapters 13 through 17 are all split between Jesus and his disciples, ending in chapter 17 with a long and beautiful prayer. Some people call it high priestly prayer, where Jesus prays from the beginning to the end of chapter 17. Jesus is praying to God, first for himself, that God will return him to the place where he was with the Father in the beginning. Second, that God will continue to protect and preserve the unity and the sanctity of his disciples, just as Jesus has been able to do for the 3.5 years he was with them. And finally, at the end of chapter 17, Jesus prays for the church, all those, he says, who will come to believe through the word that his disciples will bring. And that's us. We are the church that have come out from Jesus' earthly ministry, carried on through his disciples. Then the fourth chunk of the Gospel of John has to do with the Passion, Jesus' arrest, and his crucifixion, and then his resurrection, his ascension to be with the Father. And the Gospel ends in chapter 21 with a series of appearances by Jesus after he rose from the dead to his disciples in Galilee. And as I already noted, we're in chapter 18 right now. We're in this part of the Gospel, the Passion part, the trial, death, and resurrection part of the Gospel according to John. Last week we covered just the first 6 verses of this last big section of John's Gospel. Now let me review it in more slowly and a little more detail. If you look at your text, I'm summarizing what you can read there. After Jesus finished this long prayer that I was talking about, he and the 11 disciples that had remained with him, that is the 12 minus Judas, got up from the table and they walked out into the darkness. We know that it was nighttime and it was dark. And they went to a place where they'd often gone before, John tells us, where they'd often met together. And therefore it was a place which Judas, who was one of the original 12 disciples, also knew very well. It would be easy for Judas to find them there. The point is that Jesus knows the time is coming when he'll be taken, and he's not trying to hide from it or escape it. He's basically walking out to meet it. The other Gospels speak of the Garden of Gethsemane, or the Mount of Olives, where this place is located, where the disciples came together. Right, and then when Jesus and his 11 disciples went to that place, Judas, the 12th disciple who would betray Jesus, had caused somehow a group of Roman soldiers, probably based on the language, a rather large group of Roman soldiers, according to John's Gospel. The word he uses is a technical military expression for a group of soldiers that normally had 600 men in it. There's no way to know whether all 600 came, but in tonight's reading we'll see that they were there with the commander of the whole unit. And so he had military troops involved. He had temple guards, which had been harassing Jesus off and on, kind of like the police force that the chief priests had to keep order in the temple. Plus Roman and Jewish officials had taken lanterns and torches out into the darkness, and also weapons they had to go apprehend Jesus out there on the side of the Mount of Olives in the Garden of Gethsemane. And last week we talked a little bit about how strange it is, that they would have sent such a fearsome, almost an army or riot troops or something like that, out to get Jesus. They must have really been afraid of him.
もう彼を本当に怖が
And
って
John,
たんですね。
interestingly, is the only one of the 4 Gospels that speaks of the Roman soldiers being in this
その
group.
中にローマの兵士がいたというのを4つの福音書では
When they got
他の
there,
福音書では言って
in
ま
John's
す。
Gospel, John is really emphasizing Jesus' strength and his power. The fact
そし
that
てここ
Jesus
で
is
イエ
doing
ス、
this
ヨハネ
willingly,
はイエス
the
の
fact that
力、
Jesus 神
神
is
聖
not
な
being taken against
神の
his
力
will
を
or
持
being
っているという
taken
ことを言いたいん
by
ですね。
surprise. Jesus walks up to this large group of people who have come out looking for
そ
him.
してたくさんの人が来たところ
And
に
he
イエス
asks
は声を
them
かけま
who
す。
they're looking for. It's not a real question because John tells us right there in the same verse that Jesus knew everything that was going to happen to them. So
イエス
Jesus,
はもうすでに
when
起
he
こる
asks
ことを
them
ご存知で
who
す
they're
よね。
looking for, he's trying to get their attention, not to really ask them a real question. And the group answers,
そしてそのグル
and they
ープは
demonstrate by answering that they did know who it was that they had come out looking for. They named him. They said they were
もちろん
looking
誰を
for
探している
Jesus
のか
of Nazareth. And
イエ
and
スを知
John
って
knows
いま
that
す。
Judas was standing there, but in
で、
John's
イ
Gospel,
エスは
Judas
そ
says
の質
nothing.
問が
He
捨てられ
does
た時
nothing.
に、
This crowd of Romans and
たくさん
Jewish
の軍
soldiers and
その捕らえる
officials
集まりの
knew
中
that the
にいたん
reason
で
that
す
they
け
had
ど、
banded together with lanterns and torches and weapons in the dead of
たく
night
さん
out
の
in the
武器を
countryside
持
was
っ
to
て
get
松
some
明
guy
を持って
whose name
い
was
きます。
Jesus of Nazareth.
ね、でも
And I
ナザレのイエス
had
を
never really thought of
と
it
いうことは
until
答えま
last
す。
week when I was preparing for class, or not thought of it so completely, that by the very size of this group that went to arrest Jesus, by the nature of the group, its weapons, where it
そ
went,
して
when it went,
武器を持って
and their reaction, as we
いき
see
ます。
when Jesus identified himself of stepping back and falling to the ground, is
で
this
そして
crowd
それ
was
を
very
聞い
afraid of
て
Jesus
地
for some
に
reason. They were afraid of Jesus before
ユ
they
ダが
got there,
倒れるわ
and
け
when
で
they
す。
were confronted with Jesus, his presence was such that they were so afraid they fell to the ground. John really wants us to see the strong side of Jesus during this time
だからこの
of his
時は
arrest.
リ
And
サ
I
の青ヨ
don't
ハネ
know if I've
が
already
本
said
当に
this,
細か
but
く
this is
表
a
現してい
comment
ま
that
す。
only John adds the fact that they crossed the Kidron Valley east of Jerusalem to get to the Garden of Gethsemane, which he doesn't call it the Garden of Gethsemane, but
ヨハネ自身はこの福音書で
It's the same place
は
that
ゲッセマネの園とは書いてないんです
Matthew。and Mark call that.
でもマルコ
Only John omits
マ
the
タイ
story in the Garden of
ルカは書いてる
Gethsemane
ん
where
ですね。
Jesus prayed 3 times,
それ
please
は
take
イエ
this
スが
cup from
3
me. A
回祈
very
ったという
important story that
記
Matthew,
述で
Mark, and
他
Luke
の
really
福音
devote
書
a
で
lot
は
of
書いてあります。
space to. John doesn't describe that explicitly in his gospel. As I said already, only John mentioned that there was a large complement of Roman soldiers that
たく
went
さ
out
ん
with the
の
temple
集ま
guard
り
and
に
the other
なん
officials
か
to
軍
arrest
隊が来て
Jesus.
人々が捕らえに来た
So
というところを書い
these
てあります。
these things and other differences, which I could have listed more on the slide, and we can add some more as we read forward, show probably almost for sure that John is writing, as we've always said, later than the other gospel authors did. They were writing in the middle of the first century. John was writing at the end of the first century. John and the church that he was part of were already quite familiar with the synoptic account of Jesus' arrest. Matthew, Mark, and Luke told it. So John is aware of that story. That's part of what the church believes and confesses. And John is emphasizing other things. He's adding other things that he thought, for reasons known best to himself, thought needed to be added to his account of the gospel. He feels free to emphasize different things because the church already has what Matthew, Mark, and Luke have said. And one of the key points, I'm not the only one who says this. I noticed it when I noticed all the commentaries say the same thing. Is one of the things that John is feeling that he wants to emphasize throughout is Jesus' divine power. It starts out in the prologue. He's with God in the beginning. Everything that was made through Jesus. Jesus is in fact God. John starts there. Jesus comes down, but he's always saying, nobody takes my life from me. I lay it down. I can take it back up again. The Father and I are one. I don't do anything but what I see the Father doing. Jesus and God are so close together in John's Gospel that we can't possibly miss it. And in this account of Jesus going to the cross, although he goes to the cross and he knows that he'll die, it's something that he does completely willingly, right? It doesn't take him by surprise and it doesn't overpower him. It's something he's going to go do because he wants to show his love and obedience for God the Father. All right, now that's the review of what we've studied in John so far. And tonight we'll pick up the story at verse 7 of chapter 18 and just start by reading 7, 8, and 9 first.
読んでくださる？はい、じゃあお願いします。
そこでまた彼らに誰を探しているのかと尋ね込むと、彼らはナザレのイエスをと言った。イエスは答えられた。 私がそれであると言ったではないか。私を探しているのなら、この人たちを探せてもらいたい。それはあなたが与えてくださった人たちの中の一人も私を失わなかったとイエスの言われた言葉が成就するためである。ありがとうございます。
Okay.
So he asked them again, whom do you seek? And they said, Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus answered, I told you that I am he. So if you seek me, let these men go. This was to fulfill the word that he had spoken. Of those whom you gave me, I have lost not one.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so now let's slow down and really take our time with these verses because, well, there's nothing at all difficult, I think, to follow a narrative like this. The story, children can easily follow this narrative. There's a lot of depth here, actually, and a lot of things that I'm just starting to notice myself, so it's worth taking our time with it. Verse 7 again says, so he asked them again, whom do you seek? And they said, Jesus of Nazareth. So as I was reviewing from last week, and as we discussed a lot last week, it was like a small army of people that went out there for Jesus. They had weapons and torches and lanterns and Roman soldiers and Jewish temple guards and other officials of both Roman and Jewish persuasion. The fact that they took so many people with them, I think, really suggests that based on what Judas had said, based on what they had experienced themselves, based on what they had heard about Jesus, based on what the Holy Spirit was doing, based on what Satan was doing, I mean, whatever was going on in the world at that time, this group of people came out afraid, basically. That's why they came out big and they came out strong and they came out afraid. And a word from Jesus, as we saw last week, they fell to the ground. They took a step back. And they fall into the ground. That's where we left the story last week with them on the ground. And now Jesus forces them again to repeat who it is that they're looking for. He asked them, Jesus asked them again, whom do you seek? Right? And then they have to say again, Jesus of Nazareth. In the Bible, especially in narrative passages, one of the things you can usually safely conclude when you see something repeated a lot is that the author, and that means ultimately the Holy Spirit, is trying to emphasize that. The Bible doesn't say something over and over again for no reason. Here, twice in a row, there's been emphasis of the fact that this crowd, without anything said by Judas, Judas has done something to sort of orchestrate this betrayal. It's past Judas now. This crowd definitely knows who they've come out to find. And they definitely know who it is that they're so afraid of. And what they know is that his name is Jesus, and he's from Nazareth. Jesus of Nazareth. They're out there to get him, and they're afraid of him. Right? And so then Jesus answers them again. Verse 8, he says, I told you that I am he. So if you seek me, let these men go. And as you probably know, and we keep saying from time to time in this class, in the original Greek, the expression that's translated here, I am he, ego, eimi, is the same way that God describes himself to Abraham at the burning bush. So when Jesus says that, John, at least as an author, and his first century Greek readers, because what they hear when they hear Jesus say, I told you I am he, is something they would expect God to say. Right? It's not exactly the same actually, but it's a connection that we're supposed to see. Jesus is speaking the way God speaks here. So Jesus answers them again. He's already said this once before in the previous verse. He says again, I told you, I am he. And this lets us know, the reader, that he's projecting his divinity. Like Steve was saying last week, if we'd been there, if we'd seen Jesus, he might not have had to say anything. Just seeing his presence, his integrity, his goodness, whatever, we might have had the same reaction. Right? We don't see him, right? That was 2,000 years ago. We read this, and so the way that his words speak to us, this way we see his divinity here in the words. Okay. And so they're looking for a particular man that they're afraid of. I don't know what kind of fear it is. I think it's the bad kind and the good kind, maybe. The I'm scared kind of fear. And also, there will be that sort of reverent fear, right, that one has for God. But anyway, they're quite disconcerted, but they know that it has to do with a particular person named Jesus of Nazareth. But it's also the man, I think John wants us to know this by the way he's handling the language. John is writing this from the end of the first century with a lot of Christian reflection. They're looking for a particular man, but the particular man they happen to be looking for is God.
そしてこの人たちが探しているのは神なわけ
We
です
don't
ね。
want to lose sight of it. He's not some poor weak guy out on the side of a mountain someplace. He's God incarnate that they're
だ
looking
から
for.
そこにもう
And
神様の
the fact that they're scared is
力を
probably a
込
good
め
sign for
て
them
そ
that
の
some of
手
them
を
are
使
going
っ
to
てい
be
ます
saved one day. And then Jesus says to them, if you seek me, then let these men, his disciples,
で
go.
自分と一緒にいる弟
So
子た
their
ちを
mission
行
is
かせ
clear
て
in their
探
mind.
せて
They've
く
said
だ
it
さい
twice.
と
He's
イエ
asked
ス
them
は
twice
言い
to
ま
here
す
to apprehend a particular person. They can name him. His name is Jesus of
イ
Nazareth.
エスと呼ばれる
And so they
ナザ
have
レ
no
のイエス
excuse,
と
no
呼ばれ
reason,
る人その人
no
を
basis,
探
no
しに
legal
来た
cause
わけ
to
です
molest anybody else that happens to be with Jesus.
だからそれは彼
So
ら
he
が
says,
理
let
由
these
があっ
men
て
go.
捉えたいわけですね
And not every imperative in the Bible is a command. You know, I mean, you hear that said sometimes. But here, I feel the power here, don't you? Jesus
ここ
says,
では
let
Let
these
these
men
men
go.
go
It's not
っ
like
て
a
本当
suggestion.
に
Right? 刺
刺
have to
激
do
のように
this.
命令で
God
書い
is
てあ
telling
り
them,
ますね
let these men go. And we notice that they're not molested, right? Jesus is bound and taken away.
でイエスは
We
捕
get
ら
a
え
few
られ
verses
て
forward.
連
But
れて
none
行
of the
かれるわ
disciples
け
are
です
touched at all. They're free to go on their own. Just basically in
で
obedience to the
弟子たち
command
は
that
逃げる
Jesus
こともできる
has
んですね
given
でも
these
イエ
guys.
スはこの言葉を権威を持って言います
And then in verse 9,
そして
this is
9
now
節に行きます
not
と
Jesus speaking, but John, the author, is
ヨ
speaking
ハネ
now.
が語った語りと
He's
して書
saying
かれ
this
ていま
was
す
to fulfill the word he is Jesus. This was to
そ
fulfill the
れ
word
は
Jesus had
予
spoken.
言が成就するためであると書いてありますね
I have lost not one. All right, so
神様が
John's
与えてくださった
understanding
一人も
is
私は
that
失わな
Jesus
かっ
had
たと
spoken
い
those words.
う
We
イエス
saw
の言
Jesus
葉
speak
があ
those
りま
words
した
before. Now what he's just seen is fulfillment of
それが
prophecy.
成就した
Right?
という
Jesus' words were in chapter 17, verse 12, if you want to look.
17の12節にそれが書い
He
てあり
said,
ます
Father of all those that you've given me, I've not lost anyone except only
あな
Judas.
たがくださった
It was
人々
part
は
of
私
the
は
plan
誰
you
も
lost
失
from
い
the
ません
beginning
でし
or
たという
whatever.
ふうに祈っています
And an
17
interesting
章
thing here that I read someplace, but if you think about it, it's obviously true, is that as far as John is concerned,
で
Jesus'
ヨハ
words that
ネ
he
の理
spoke
解によれ
are
ば
the same as the words of the prophetic words of God in the Old Testament, the same
旧
force
約
of
聖
Scripture, the
書
same
の予
force
言
of
と同じ
prophecy.
ように全てが
Here
成
to
就するん
John,
ですね
it's all the same. He's saying that these actions fulfill what's in effect the prophecy. The words
だ
of
から旧
Jesus
約
is
聖
spoken
書
must
の
come
予
true.
言があって成
And
就したというのと
he says, you see
同
that
じ
they are
書き
coming
方
true
を
here.
イエスの言葉が成就したというふうに書いて
And
ま
God
す
is not going to
17 章
let
のイエ
his
スの
people,
祈りの言
not
葉です
even one, be
で誰
destroyed
一人も失わ
by
れなかった
Satan or by the forces of Satan and the world controlled by Satan. We
それ
live
は
in
こ
the
の世
world.
は
It's
サ
a
タンが
dangerous
コントロ
place.
ールしてるんです
But
け
if
れ
you
ども
belong
で
to
も
God,
神
if
様
God
が
has
そこ
given
に
you to
働いてるんで
Jesus,
すね
if Jesus
で神様がイエスに与えた人は誰もイエスは失
it's
わなかった
absolutely impossible for you to be lost.
そして
This
そう
is
いう
something
人
that
たち
Christians
は
are
道に
supposed
迷
to
うことは
be
ないで
confident
す
of. And there are fancy names for it. The reformers used to call this the doctrine of perseverance of the saints. Once you're saved, you're always saved. I mean, if
そ
you're
して
Christian,
生徒の
there's
人たち
nothing that
に
could
は
ever
迫
happen
害があるということを言いましたね
to compromise that. Other people call it the doctrine of eternal security, and it's something,
です
at
から
least
あ
in
る
this
人
church,
は
Pastor
永遠
Dennis
に私たちは
frequently
守ら
mentions,
れ
and I
ている
think
という言葉を
appropriately
言いま
so.
す
And it's grounded in texts like these. Jesus is saying, everyone that God gives to Jesus,
神
he
様
doesn't
がイエ
lose
ス様
one,
に
not
与え
one.
た方
He's
は
the good
誰
shepherd.
も
All the sheep are there.
失
You
わ
can't
な
sort of
か
be
ったと
saved and then not saved and then saved again and not saved again. It doesn't work that way. It's a one-way street. And once you go to Jesus, you're saved forever because
イエ
your
スを
salvation doesn't
救
depend
い
on
主
you
とし
anymore.
て
It
信じた
depends
人
on
は
Jesus.
もう
And
一度
Jesus
救われたらずっと
always
救わ
wins.
れるんですね
All right, and I think here, I realized myself after I was reading it for a while, I'm reading a little bit too superficially. I was thinking Jesus is trying to say something like, okay, I stopped the Romans from arresting my disciples, even though they got me, but I protected them.
でだ
No.
から自分はこう
He's
自
not
分
talking
が
even
助けるんだというふうには
primarily
進
about
め
their
ていきません
physical safety. We know that they're going to, that they're not safe physically, right? Every one of these guys is eventually going to give up his life for the word of God.
そしてこの弟子たちが守られる
But
こ
what
と
he's
は
talking
イエスは
about is
ご
the
存知
eternal
ですねその
salvation
こ
of
とを
these
口に
11
出してい
guys
るん
and
で
the
す
eternal
ね
salvation of everybody who comes to Christ through them, which is all of us, right?
そして私たち
Everybody
も
who was
含
ever
めて
saved in
全
the
てイ
history
エ
of
ス
the
を
world
信
was
じる
saved
者は
through the
救わ
apostolic
れ
church.
ます
If the Romans had taken those guys now,
ローマの人たち
we'd
が
all be
今
in
それを
trouble,
捕ま
right?
えようと
Because
しても
they would have all been dead, or like Peter, they weren't strong enough yet to
彼
step
らは
up
ペ
to
テロ
the
も含め
challenge
てまだ
that
そ
they
れほ
would
ど
be
強く
strong
は
enough
ないですね
later
まだ
to handle it, and the Holy Spirit comes and they're more mature. But right now they're not. They're
でも
weak
ま
and
だ
they're
ち
easily
ゃんと
scattered
彼
and
ら
they're
は
afraid.
力を得て
Peter
ない
can't
です
even confess that he knows Jesus at this point.
イエ
Right?
スを
And
知っ
so
ているというふう
if
に
Jesus
あ
hadn't
の
protected him at this point, then there wouldn't be any church, right? I think that's the gist of it. When Jesus says, I'm fulfilling the word that I've spoken, that those whom God gave me, I haven't lost anyone. He means
でここで書いていることは
eternal.
神が
None
与
of
え
the
た人
people who
誰
ever
一人
destined to be
失わ
saved
な
by
かった
Christ
とい
are
う
ever
ことが
lost, because Jesus is the one who does the saving. Okay, so that's the first 3 verses of tonight's reading. Any comment or question?
で質問がここまでのところありましたら言ってください
So they've got the big scary group of guys are out, and they've got Jesus now. Let's read on. 10 to 14.
じゃあ木村さん読んでください 10節から14まで
シモン・ペテロは剣を持っていたが、それを抜いて大祭司のしもべに切りかかり、その耳を切り落とした。そのしもべの名はマルコスであった。するとイエスはペテロに言われた。剣を鞘に収めなさい。父が私にくださった杯は飲むべきではないか。それから一体の兵卒やその戦卒長やユダヤ人の下役どもがイエスを捕らえ縛り上げて、まずアンナスのところに引き連れて行った。彼はその土地の大祭司カヤパの舅であった。カヤパは前に一人の人が神のために死ぬのは良いことだとユダヤ人に助言したものであった。
Anybody likes to read? Billy, you want to read?
Sure. Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. So Jesus said to Peter, "Put your sword into its sheath. Shall I not drink the cup of the Father has given me?" So the band of soldiers and their captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. First they led him to Annas, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest of that year. It was Caiaphas who had advised the Jews that it would be expedient that one man should die for the people.
Okay, so Jesus and this crowd that's come out to arrest him have now come together. And verse 10 continues, and it says,
11
Then
節が続きます
Simon Peter,
シモン・ペテロ
having a
は
sword, drew it
剣を持って剣を持
and
ってい
struck
た
the
の
high
で
priest's servant and cut
そ
off
れを
his
抜
right
いて
ear.
大祭司のしもべに切
The
りかかっ
servant's
た
name was
そ
Malchus.
して右の耳を切り落としたと書いてあります
I understand sword might be a little bit of a grand translation of this word. It could also be like a dagger or a knife or something like that. You don't
ナイ
have to
フとか
imagine
そういう
it's
言
like
葉であったと思いますね
a big sword, but it's big enough to cut off somebody's
とにか
ear.
く耳を切り落とすに十分な長さのあるものであった
Now, I said before, when the Bible repeats something, it's usually good to stop and think, well, maybe it's important.
だからここで
and
また立ち止まって
Whenever
考え
each
る
of the
必
four
要があ
Gospels,
り
all
ます
four Gospels think that it was important to pay a lot of attention to something. It's the same deal. You better stop and
なん
think,
か同じ
maybe
ことを見
that's
聞き
pretty
しても
important. So I
強調する
checked,
部分によって
and
書く方が
I find that all four
多
Gospels
く書いたり少
remember
なく書いた
this
り
part of the story. They
こ
remember
の
Peter
部
having
分
had
を覚え
a
てる方がい
sword
らっしゃ
or
ると思い
two.
ますけど
They remember Peter drawing a sword. They remember that he struck off the high priest's ear. They remember it was his right ear, most
ね
of all.
右耳というふうにね書いてありますね
Only John remembers the
ヨ
name
ハネはここで名
Malchus,
前を
which
記
is
してるんです
interesting,
ね
and you could stop and
ちょっと
wonder
興味深いこと
why would John know that, and why would John think it was
ど
important
うし
to
て
add that? Certainly,
ヨハ
one
ネ
of
は
the
マ
things
ルコ
that
っていう
teaches
こ
us
とを知
about
っ
the
て
Bible is
これを
that
書い
each
た
of the gospel authors felt the freedom in the Holy Spirit to say things that the other guys didn't say, right? I mean, they're giving their own account, and he said something none of the others did. Luke, if you remember, Luke's account remembers that Jesus actually reached down and fixed the
で
guy's
ル
ear.
カで
And
は
that's
耳を
that's
こうつ
only
けたと
one
い
of
う
the
書
four
き
that
方をして
remembers
います
that
ね
part of the
ルカ
story.
で
Luke was a physician, and so maybe it's not that strange that he would be the one that would focus on the healing. You know.
ですからそれはイエス
So,
が
but for whatever reason, we can
イエ
never
ス
know
の
for
力があ
sure.
った
Each
の
of the
で
gospel
当然それは起こりうることです。
authors thought that this story about Peter fighting with the sword was important to keep
そしてここ
in the
ではむ
Bible,
しろ
even though
剣
their
を持って
emphasis
ペテロ
was
が
a
戦
little
ったという
different
こ
one
と
to
を
the
強
other.
調して書いています
Do we
ね。
know any cultural emphasis why naming the name?
名前を付けたということで何か意味があるんでしょうか。名前を書いたっていう。
As far as I know, there's no sort of like magical thing going
No.
on, you know. But I suppose, you know, some people have said, well, you know, you wonder about the identity of the author John, right? And there was, in the 2nd century, it was sort of widely believed that John was actually a priest who was the Apostle John who also wrote this gospel. And if it's true, then he would have known things such as the name of the servant of the high priest. Later, you'll see when Peter gets into the courtyard, because there's another disciple in there who helps him get past the girl who's watching the gate. But John never tells you the name of that other disciple who's in there who knew the high priest family. One theory is it's John.
Okay.
So it's possible that it's the beloved apostle has some more information about things having to do with the family of the high priest and other disciples. And something like that. But the thing about stuff like that, and why I don't talk about it a lot, is nobody actually knows, right? People write lots of books, but nobody knows for sure. Sure, I don't know, but I don't know.
So there's a personal nature to this.
The other thing is, it might be Malchus was a disciple later, and he was part of the Christian community, and they just remember, hey, the guy with the ear over there, you know, he was, right?
Possible, yeah.
And it might be, yeah, that was Ricky Johnson. To me, it's why I believe the Bible. There's stuff like this. You can't ever know exactly what was going on in John's mind when he wrote it, but the fact that they didn't all get together and match up all their details is very reassuring.
It's
actually because it has different accounts.
Yeah.
That is believable.
And for 2,000 years, people have been talking a lot about this kind of stuff, right? Maybe this, maybe that, maybe this.
なんか2000年の間、聖書を読んで人々はいろいろ意見を言いますね。ここの部分の
There's St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, and those guys didn't figure it out. I don't think I'm going to figure it out. But what I did want to ask is, I think a more interesting and important question is, why do you think, and I don't know the answer to this question, but
答えは自分自身ははっきり知りませんけど、
do
な
we
ぜこれ
think that all four of them thought it was important to remember that Peter took out a sword and
ペ
fought?
テロが
Skip the
剣を
details,
取
but I
っ
mean,
て
the point
切
is,
りかかって耳を落としたことがどう
grabbed the sword and decided to go, you know, on the attack physically against this
要す
big
る
armed
にもうちゃん
group
と
of
行動を
people.
とって
Why-
こ
why-
う攻撃しようとしたんですね、ペテロが。そのことがどういう
I'm not so interested in the
要素があるかと
question
いう
of
ことを
why
考え
did
てく
Peter
ださい。
do it, although that might be part of it, but why did the gospel authors think it was really important for us to?
だからどうしてこの福音書でそれをヨハネは大切なこととして記しているのでしょうか。
Actually, what I think it has to do with that everybody was expecting Jesus to be the Messiah that would
で、イエスがメシアだと誰もみんな望ん
overcome
でました
Rome.
ね。
So the kind of the
ローマを
worldly,
倒す人たちとい
you
う
might
こと
say,
で。
the worldly things. And this is actually Jesus of the kingdom of heaven.
で
So
イエスがまあ神の国を
Peter
支
is
配している
starting
人
out
ですか
with
ら
the sword as a way from the viewpoint of the kingdom of the world, and or the how to say the worldly Christ, you might say, as opposed to the heavenly Christ.
Yeah, and in one of the to support your point, in one of the gospel accounts, and I'm forgetting which one,
まあ福音書の
in
別
connection
のとこ
with
ろ
this
でも書
story,
いてある部分があるんですけども
Jesus says, "My kingdom is not of this world. Don't you know that if my kingdom was of this world, I could have called legions of angels down here to fight for me, right? I don't need you, Peter."
Yeah. And he
Kind of
said
thing, right?
legions of
Which means
angels.
Jesus gives the same answer that you're giving right now, is that one of the important things about this is that it gives us an opportunity to see what Jesus' kingdom is and what Jesus' kingdom is not. Right?
イエ
And
ス
Jesus'
の王
kingdom is
国が
not
どういうものなのか、そしてどういうものでないのか、すごくはっきりするところだと思い
It
ま
may
す
be
ね
that Luke felt the need to recount the healing just to emphasize that from another
で
direction.
ルカの
This
方は
wasn't.
耳を
It
癒
was
すとこ
supposed
ろ
to
を
be a
強調
purely
して書い
gracious
てるわ
act,
けで
not
す。
some violent thing, right? So whatever.
And of all the disciples, Peter showed the greatest contrast of being hard to learn about these things.
Yeah, Peter
Right?
was
You know,
sort
and
of-
so I think we can associate even further of our own misinterpretation. We lined up with Simon Peter on this one.
このシモン・ペテロの行動ですね。それも注目して。
We
Will the flesh.
we charge out there, hey God, we're gonna do this.
で自分たちはこう
Anybody else?
す
God
るみ
says,
たい
I
な。
didn't ask you to do this.
Does anybody else have a thought? Why is it, the question is, why is it important to
So I
know
think that
Peter did?
later that Peter said that I don't know Jesus, but that John reminds that he was brave. Some part.
Okay.
Yeah, when he betrayed, I don't know. It means that he was shrink like this, but other time he was strong enough to attack them.
Yeah, and all four
だから
guys,
ペテロは後に私は彼を知らないと言いますね。でもすごく臆病な面もあるけど、ここではヨハネは彼のためにこういうふうにいや勇敢に彼をやったんだみたいに言いたかった。
and there's no gospel according to Peter, so these four other guys were writing about Peter, right? And they're telling bad things about Peter, how he betrayed the Lord
で
three
だから
times.
どうやってイ
Maybe
エ
they
スを裏切ったかっていうのをみんな
maybe
書
they
いていますね。
like it should be balanced, and they should show
だ
the
から
good
ちょっと
parts
そ
of
れ
Peter
と、
also.
バランスを取るみたいなペテロの強い部分も書いている。
What did you?
この時点でまだ
In this time,
ピーターがイエスがなぜ十字架にかかるっていう意味がまだ分かってなかった。
Peter didn't understand that well that why Jesus was crucified on the cross.
そのためにイエスが十字架にかからないように、
So that he tried not to let Jesus die on the cross.
Yeah. I think that's also true.
まあそれも本当だと思います。
Any other thing that comes to you? There's probably a lot more. You know, the only thing I can say is that the fact that all four Gospels thought that this was something important, not just to remember, but actually to devote a number of verses to, means that we're supposed to take time to think about it. And some of the
他
reasons
の
why
福
it's
音書で
important
も
we've
ペテ
mentioned,
ロの
and
こ
there's
とが書いてある
probably
ので、決して小さな出来事がないんですね。
one
私
new
のこと
thought
も
that,
考えてくだ
that
さい。
came to me was, and kind of counterpoint to your point, is I think always in my life I thought, sort of like you said, it's Peter might not have been the wisest person or the most careful person or whatever, but at least he was sort of
ペ
brave
テロはいつ
and
も
loyal
ちょ
and
っと行
stuff.
動に移しますね。いつも
He's
なん
always
か
saying stuff,
白
I'll
深いと
follow
は言い
you
ませ
wherever,
んけれども。
even if I die, and so forth and
で
so on.
私は死んでもあなたの特に
And I
つ
think
いて
in
きま
some
すみ
sense
た
that
いな
must
こ
be
とを
true.
言った人ですので。
But I was just thinking, Jesus has just frightened the soldiers nearly to death. Like they took a step down and they're on the ground.
ね、本当
Jesus
に
is completely in control of the
倒れましたよね、地
situation.
に。それ
And
ぐらい
Peter
恐れ
spent
て
the
る
last 3.5 years walking around with Jesus,
で、
with
ペテロが
everybody in
3年
Palestine
半の間
hating
イエ
them.
スと共に
Nobody's
行
laid
動
a
し
hand
ま
on
した。
them, and Jesus is still there. And so
で、イエスはまだそ
there's
こ
a
におられる
different
わけです
way of thinking, which might be to say that with the Son of God standing there to protect him, Peter's act might not seem so
神
heroic.
の
if you
御
think
子
about
が
it, right?
自分を助けてくだ
I
さる。
remember being in the
そういう思い
playground
があった
having
んで
big
す。
friends, standing by, and I suddenly got tougher
More
too.
confident, huh? Yeah.
So it's not a pure act of heroism. I don't
だから
suppose.
まあ、ペテロがそういう行動を起こしてもイエス様が守ってくださるっていうそばにいる安心感、それもあったんだと思います。
Might be his only chance to knock off the ear of the high priest's servant while Jesus is standing there.
Well,
wait.
but, oh, go ahead.
Well, this is the first time we've seen, Simon was a lot of talk, but we can really understand that fishermen have a lot of skills, and he held a lot of it back. He cut a lot of fish, and he could be pretty
まあ、
accurate
ペ
with
テ
the
ロがい
sword.
ろんな意味、いろん
But
な
you know
こ
what
とが
I'm
でき
saying
ま
is
す。
that
魚もた
this
く
is
さ
the
ん
first
捕
time
まえられたし、
something well deep inside him caused him to act physically, which he contained all the other times, which is interesting. So there was great emotions on both sides of this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's probably a very complicated mixture of things, like all
なんか
human
いろい
beings
ろな
are,
要素があり
right?
ますね。とて
Brave,
も
cowardice,
感情
good
の
and bad all
なんか
mixed
大き
together
く動
because
く
that's
人
the
で
way
あったと
we
いう
are,
こともありますし、
Yeah, it is normally what you would do if you
ま
wanted
あ自然の行動だったん
protect
じゃないでしょ
somebody,
う
I
か。
suppose.
Yeah.
Just a natural instinct, kind of.
So anyway, I think on balance, we could find some merit in what Peter did, but on balance you have to decide it was sort of not what God was doing there, right? It's sort of ill-advised and apart from the will of God. And that may be one lesson that we learned from Peter in general. I was thinking, I read this also. So many foolish things we do as Christians because we're zealous wrongly, right? Especially young Christians. At least I was. I mean, you think God needs you. You think God needs you to protect him, you know. A.W. Tozer says, you protect God like you protect a lion. Get out of his way, right? God doesn't need us to protect him. And surely Jesus didn't need Peter to protect him, right? And so Peter, that's another thing Peter didn't understand. Or C.S. Lewis says, God doesn't have any trouble managing his enemies. It's his friends that give him trouble. Which is exactly right. I mean, Jesus has more trouble with Peter than he does with Satan. He can just get rid of Satan anytime he wants to, right? So, with those of us who are objects of his grace, he's got a lot more challenge in store. Okay. So then, verse 11, Jesus says to Peter, put your sword into its sheath. Shall I not drink the cup that the Father has given me? And that was your point before about Peter not understanding what Jesus was doing. Peter still was failing to understand Jesus' mission on earth. Right? And that's not surprising. I mean, it's not easy to understand what Jesus was going to accomplish on the cross. Jesus hadn't done it yet. Jesus hadn't died. Jesus hadn't risen from the dead. The Holy Spirit hadn't come. So it's not at all surprising that Peter wouldn't understand. But like I said before, the fact that he thought Jesus needed his protection was kind of strange. Okay. And then I said before that John, among all of the four Gospels, does not remember the scene in the Garden of Gethsemane where Jesus prayed 3 times, Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Mark, Matthew, and Luke all do remember that. But whenever John leaves out a key story like that, all the cases I can think of is, he has the same thought incorporated into his gospel in some other way. Right? And here, when he refers to shall I not drink the cup that the Father has given me, probably the first century church automatically understood that it was a reference to the story in Gethsemane where Jesus prayed that the cup be taken away. But here, in John's gospel, like I said, with John's emphasis is on Jesus' divine overmastering power of every situation. This is the treatment that John prefers to give in his gospel, that Jesus is saying to Peter, look, don't fight that way. I have to drink this cup. We're not trying to get out of it. Whereas the other gospel authors needed us to understand Jesus was a human being who didn't want to die. Both things are true. Okay, so verse 12 says, the band of soldiers and their captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. So, from everything that's gone before, it's clear Jesus was not taken by surprise. He went out to the place where he knew that they would apprehend him. He'd known since chapter 6 that this was going to happen. Jesus always knew that this was going to happen. It's not happening against his will. With just a word, he could put the whole army on the ground. So it's not by surprise. It's not against his will. It's something he's doing voluntarily at the appointed time in obedience to the will of God. Right? And so it's even kind of ironic, and John is ironic throughout in this way, the whole gospel, to speak of Jesus being arrested and bound even by such a powerful company of men. You know, it's not like they were doing it against his will, right? He's almost in control of the situation, almost as if he had arrested them. Okay. And John again underscores the powerfulness of this group, not just in terms of their swords and their number, but also politically, because he notices that this cadre of soldiers was under the command of a centurion, which would have
そ
been
れ
a
は
fairly
戦
senior
争長
commander
の
of
下で動く
military
人たち
garrison
で
there. And
す
so
ね。
whether there were 600 or 1,000
そ
soldiers
れは
or
もう
some smaller subset of the guys,
600人いようが1000人いようが
cohort, the commander of that large of a number of troops was actually there with
で
them
すから
present.
動
So
か
a
す
really
ちゃん
powerful
としたも
military
う一番の戦
figure
争長とか
of
い
the
るわ
Roman
けで
Empire
す。
was there in addition to the Pharisees we were told before and the
もちろ
officials
ん
of
パリ
the temple.
サイ人もそういう中に加わっています。
And still, they're only arresting
捕らえに行った
Jesus
人の中
because
に
he's ready to go.
もうイエスは準備ができていく準備ができてたわけです。
And it says that they first led him to Annas.
そして最初はアンナスのところに引き連れて行ったと書いてあるんですね。
By the way, high priest isn't a yearly office. I mean, Caiaphas was high priest for 18 years. Annas was high priest for 9 years.
そして
Ordinarily,
カヤ
high
パと
priests
そ
were
れ
high
か
priests for
ら
a
ア
number
ン
of
ナ
years.
も祭司長だったんですね。
What this means is in that memorable year or something
大
like
祭
that.
司でだから何
The
年か
grammar is
の
not supposed to
間
suggest it was an annual
それを
thing.
務めました。
Caiaphas was a high priest for 18 years, which is longer than any other high priest in the history of the
18
temple.
年の間カヤパが大祭司だったんですね。かなり長い在位です。
Okay, and despite the fact that Jesus is taken by this powerful group
イエ
of
スはも
Roman
うそういう軍隊とかに囲まれて
religious figures, they didn't take him
連
to
れて
appear
行かれるわけですけ
before the
ど、
Roman officials directly.
まあローマの
Probably that's just
兵
because it
隊
was
たちが
nighttime.
連
Remember,
れ
this
て
is
行か
night,
れ
and
ま
you
す。
wouldn't normally be able to take somebody before Pilate, for example, until sunup. I read somewhere it's ordinary for the Roman guys to try to start doing their business at sunup and get it out of the way by 10 or 11 so they could goof off for the rest of the day. But you wouldn't go to Pilate in the middle of the night, right? So
でも
this has happened. They've
夜に
gotten
これ
up
が
for dinner,
行
they went
われ
out
る
to
わ
the
けです
dark,
ね。
they've been apprehended, they're taken. We know it's dark because we see Peter warming himself in front of a fire.
で、寒い
It's dark,
時でしょう。
it's
イエス
light.
が手を温め
So
手
they've
で
got
イエスを
to go
手を
somewhere
温めたという
before
記
they
述
can
があ
go
り
to
ますから
Pilate. And according to John's recollection, where they went first of all was to the house of Annas.
で、
Who was the
ヨハネが
father-in-law
覚えているのは
of
最
Caiaphas.
初は
And
アン
Caiaphas
ナ
was
ス
the
の
high
ところ
priest
に引き連れて行かれたと書いてあります。
And it's interesting they didn't take him directly to Caiaphas. It's possible
で、
for
最
the
初
same
にカ
reason.
ヤ
It
パの
was
ところ
just
に連れて行かないんです
too
ね。
early for any sort of official business. That's
だか
less
らまあ
clear.
公的にはカヤパのところに行くべきだったのが
Just
最
for
初
your
はアンナス
information,
の
Annas
ところへ
had been the high priest, I forgot the years, before Jesus was born. He was high priest for 9 years. Before, when Jesus was a
ちょっと
little
在位を覚えてないんですけども。
And then he was deposed by some Roman ruler, but 5 of his sons plus his son-in-law Caiaphas all followed him as high priest. So he was like the head of a clan of high priests. The whole family, they were all high
家
priests.
族全員が
And he
何
was
か
like
こう
the
いう
elder of
大
all
祭
of
司の
them.
役
So
を
he had
持
a
っている
great
ぐ
deal
らい
of power,
なんです
even though
ね
he wasn't actually the sitting high priest. And they were famous even among the Jews for being the most
ユダヤ
corrupt,
人の中で
wicked
も有名
people.
な人たち
If you
なん
read
です。
Roman history, I mean, outside the Bible, this family of high priests was really not liked by anyone. They were really not nice guys. So that's the kind of people they were, you know. Annas and
なんかユ
his
ダヤ人の
son-in-law
中ではもう
Caiaphas
有
and
名な人たちです
his other sons who had also been high priests. Only John mentions that Jesus was first led to Annas. Everybody
で、
else has him go straight.
ヨハネだけが最初アンナスのところに引き連れて行
And the
っ
only
た
thing I can figure from this, other than like I've been saying, we're supposed to notice that each of the gospel authors feels free to remember it from his
だ
own
から
point
そ
of
れぞれ
view.
の人が
Or
覚えて
the
る部
point
分
we
も違
were
いま
talking
す
about
けど、
earlier,
そ
I
の
mean,
ところも
maybe
違い
John
ま
is
す
one of the characters, and he's commenting on the parts of the story where he was physically there. I mean, if he really was the other disciple, then of course he would naturally want to write about the thing where he was an eyewitness or something like that.
だから
But probably
ヨ
the
ハネ
whole
は
thing
何
was
となく
really
そこに一緒にいたんです
complex
ね
and。confusing. If you think about it, it's all irregular. How did Judas procure a bunch of Roman soldiers and
だ
temple
からど
guards
う
to go
や
out and
っ
arrest
てユダ
Jesus?
がその人たちを連れて行ったか、そこ
There's no
の
legal
ところは
basis for any of the
しま
charges
せんね
against Jesus as we see the thing play out. The whole thing is kind of a political
だから全体が政治的な部分の
maybe
要
it's
素を持っ
being
ていたわけで
instigated
す
by
から、
Annas
事
or
件
other
に関
members
して
of
は
his family or whatever. They just go here first of all. Nobody knows actually.
で、なぜ最初そこ
But
に行ったの
John
かは
does
誰もわ
remind
から
us
ないところで
of
すけど、
something that he's told us before back in chapter 11, verse 45 and following. is that
11
Caiaphas
章のところ
was
に
the one who had
45
told the
節書いてありま
Jews
す。
that it would be better in effect, for Jesus to die than for the whole country to
で
suffer
その
the
人が
consequences of
一人
having
の人が
Jesus
神のために死ぬことはいいことだと言ったんです。
draw the ire of the Roman Empire. So the Annas Caiaphas family throughout John's Gospel have been conspiring to arrest Jesus and put Jesus
で
to
イエ
death
スを
whenever
捕らえ
they
た
could.
り、そういうことにアンナスも関わりあっていたわけです。
Okay, so Annas and Caiaphas and all the rest of those guys have been plotting Jesus' death for some time, and now the time is coming. Let's read 3 more before we.
はい、じゃあ3節の間、もう一つね、読んでみます。18章の15から18。
シモン・ペテロともう一人の弟子がイエスについていた。この弟子は大祭司の知り合いであったので、イエスと一緒に大祭司の中庭に入った。しかし、ペテロは外で戸口に立っていた。すると、大祭司の知り合いであるその弟子が外に出て行って、門番の女に話し、ペテロを家に入れてやった。すると、この門番の女がペテロに言った。あなたもあの人の弟子の一人ではありませんか。ペテロは、いや、そうではないと答えた。しもべが下焼くどもは寒い時であったので、炭火を起こし、そこに立って当たっていた。ペテロもまた彼らに混じり、立って当たっていた。
はい、ありがとうございます。
Okay. Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, he entered with Jesus into the court of the high priest. But Peter stood outside at the door. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the servant girl who kept watch at the door and brought Peter in. The servant girl at the door said to Peter, You also are not one of this man's disciples, are you? He said, I'm not. Now, the servant and the officials had made a charcoal fire because it was cold, and they were standing and warming themselves. Peter was also with them, standing and warming himself.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so verse 15 says, Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple.
でさあ、シモン・ペテロ
Since
ともう
that
一人
disciple
の
was
弟子、
known to the high priest
そのもう一人の弟子は大祭司の知り合いだったとか。
of the high priest. All right, so this begins John's account
これ
of
は
Peter's
ヨ
denial
ハ
of
ネが
Jesus.
書
As I
いた。
mentioned before, all
結
4 of the
局、
Gospels
ペテロが否定する
showcase
ところで
the
すね、イエ
story
ス
of
を。
Peter's denial of
ここから
Jesus.
始まるわけ
The
です。
Bible thinks that's an important story for us to see from several different points of view.
だからそこが重要なことだとして福音書ではいくつか違って書いていますね。
And most of what the 4 Gospels remember is substantially the same, but there are some little differences.
だからこう最後
John
では
adds
ちょっ
some
と違って
unique
ます。
detail from his
で、
later
ヨハネは
perspective.
詳しくここの部分を書いてありますね。
In particular, we see here that there was another disciple, and I checked the other Gospels. There's no other disciple in this story.
で、他には他の弟子がいたとは書いてないんですけど、ヨハネによる福音書はペテロと一緒
But
に
Peter was
他の弟子
accompanied
がいた
by
と書いてあります。
another disciple. And there's been a great deal of discussion for the better part of 20 centuries about who
20
the other
世紀
disciple is, and
21
nobody
世紀の
knows
私たち誰でしょうかと言ったんですけど。
for certain. I mentioned before, one of the theories that people like a lot is that maybe it's the beloved disciple that was mentioned
愛
in
さ
chapter
れた弟
13.
子という言葉にも書かれてますね。
If that's so, then maybe the beloved disciple was John, and maybe the beloved disciple was John as the author of John's Gospel. There's
そ
a
し
lot
てヨ
of
ハネの福音
maybe
書を
that
書いた人であろうと言
people
われま
have.
す。
And of course, no way to be absolutely certain about something like that.
ですからそのことをはっきり
But
分か
whomever
って
this
書いたとい
other
う
disciple was, and it might also have not been one of the 11 disciples, it could have been one of the Jerusalem disciples or something like that who
で
happened to
弟子
have
と言われるのは必ずしも
contacts
11
in
人
the
でな
court
く
of,
他の弟子もいたわけ
of the
で
high
す。
priest or whatever. That's another theory. Some
だけど
people
まあ
have.
大祭司の知り
Whoever
合い
it
という
is,
こと
he
で
is
す。
a disciple of Jesus, and is known to the high priest, and the verb here that gets translated as known doesn't mean just they recognize the name. It means some familiarity.
まあちょっと知り合いだったということです。ただ名前を知っているわ
More
け
than
じゃ
just
なく、
knowing who the person is, there's some
どういう
relationship
人かという
between
ことも分かっていた
the
と
high
いうよう
priest
な
and
時
this
の書き
guy,
方
enough so
で
that he can
知り合い
command
だったと
the
いう
door
のを
servant girl to let people into the high priest's
そして
house.
中に入れてくれたということですね。
Right? And this explains how this other disciple, whoever it may be, and Peter were able to gain admission to the court of the high priest, which you might
で
have
すから
wondered
第
how,
一祭
how,
司
how you
の
could
中
do
庭
that.
に入ることができる
How
ん
would
です
they
けど
take Jesus and just some fisherman just wanders into the court of the high priest? You can see Peter
ですか
did.
ら大祭司がただの
John
領主
remembers
が
that
入
Peter
れ
got
る
in
道
because
を入
somebody
れ
who
ない
already knew the high priest
もうす
helped
で
him
に
to get
知っ
into
てい
the
る
court.
者が
That's
こ
why
う
he
連れて
was
行く
in
こ
there.
と
So it's a detail worth having that John's given us on top of
で
what
ヨ
we
ハネ
read
は
from
心当たり
Matthew,
を
Mark,
詳し
and
く
Luke.
記しています。
Verse 16 says Peter
16
stood outside at the door. So the other disciple who was known to the high priest went out and spoke to the servant girl who kept watch at the door and brought Peter in. So
ペ
that's how
テロは
Peter
外
got
で特人立ってい
inside
た。すると
the
大祭
court
司の知り合いだった弟子
of the
が
high
外に
priest,
出て
who,
門番の女
according
に
to
ペ
his
テロを中
recollection,
に
he
入れ
means
たと書いてあるんで
Annas,
すね。
the father-in-law of Caiaphas. And I said this already, but I forgot I had it on a slide. There was a tradition in the 2nd century that the Apostle John was a priest who authored the 4th Gospel. And if that's true, it would be interesting because, and I don't know if it's true, but if it were true, it would be interesting because it would explain things like how did they know the name of the servant whose ear they cut off and stuff like that, right? Because it would be somebody who was familiar with the business of the high priest and his family. It was a fairly big family too, so it's not that hard to imagine that somebody who was a disciple of Jesus would
だから
have
大祭司
been
の
a
知
childhood
り合い
friend
で
of
あ
the
った
high
弟子
priest's
という
family.
ことが、
Likely
当時ちょっといろいろな人に知られたわけです
Verse 17, it says, the servant
で
girl at the
17
door
節
said to Peter, you're also not one of this man's disciples, are you? He said, I am not. I noticed when you read that, you
Yeah.
know,
ここでもうすでに
the
「I
grammar
am not
is
私
extremely
はそのもの
difficult
では
in
ない」と
English
否
and
定
Greek
す
and
るん
probably
です
in
ね
every other language. People struggle with the grammar here.
で
The
ここで
meaning is
まあちょっ
shines
と
through,
英
but
語
the
的
grammar
な
is difficult.
Yeah.
One thing almost all of the, as you know, I'm not a great Greek scholar, but one thing most all of the
ギリ
Greek
シャ語と英
text
語の違い
commentators
でもあ
will
るんです
say
ね
is
書き方やトラン
that
スレ
one
ー
thing you read from this grammar is that the other disciple was known as a disciple of Jesus.
で他のもの別の
At
弟
least
子
by the
がイエ
servant
スの
girl
弟
at
子
the
だ
door,
と
but
知られてい
probably
たと
by
いう
other
見方
people.
もで
It
きる
was
んで
just
すね
known that this person was a disciple of Jesus. And so most of them said that the most straightforward way to read this is the servant girl says, well, your friend who let you in as a disciple of Jesus, are you a disciple of Jesus too?
あな
And
た
Peter
も
said,
だからもう連れて行った人はイエスの弟子だとしていた
which is
この人
interesting,
もそう
really.
ですか
It
み
means
たい
that
な
there is a
考え
disciple of
読み
Jesus
取れるん
who's
です
not denying Jesus.
で
The
も
one
う
who's
一人の弟
inside
子は
and
イエスを
got
否定してない
Peter
んですね
inside.
弟
Was,
子だっ
was
たって
Peter
みんな
trying
が
to
知っている書き
deflect from
方です
himself because after he just slain the ear, I mean, wiped out the ear off of one, and it's now known in the courts of some of the soldiers and all that, so maybe he didn't want to
耳を切
bring
り落と
attention
したの
that
で
he's
周りの
very
人が
close
それを
to
気がつい
Jesus.
てたっていうのもありま
I
す
don't know.
で
That's
そこ
an
までは
interesting-
分かりませんね
I mean, it'd be funny if you went to the door and said, let me in, and the guy said, huh? I have to work on that joke.
Or is it that the other disciple is Judas?
Well, I thought of that too. I mean, if the other
Oh, that's
disciple,
interesting, huh?
他の弟子っていう
Judas
の
because
は
we
ユ
know-
ダっていうこともありますか
we know that Judas was recognized as a disciple. We know that Judas has
ユ
had
ダはも
dealings
ちろんイエスの
with
弟子
the
だ
high
ったと
priest
いうことはみん
family.
な知ってますね
And yeah, I think there are other people who have speculated that also.
で
It could
そう
have
いう
been
見方を
Judas,
するもちろん他の人もい
could have
ま
been
す
John,
確かに
could have been a Jerusalem disciple, could have been the
あるいは
beloved
レサ
disciple,
ミレに
but
い
that
た
might
弟
not be
子たち
John.
という
That's
ことも
another
考えられ
thing.
るしその別の弟子が誰であったか
But it is interesting because I think we tend to forget in John's account there's another disciple who was recognized as a disciple who was in there.
で他の弟子たちがイエスの弟子とし認識
Well,
さ
aren't
れ
they
ながらそこにい
excused
た
allowed
ということが
witnesses to be in attendance, but not being accused also? The witness of the party of Christ?
Well, I mean, this this one especially was no organized judicial proceeding.
Okay.
They're not even before any recognized official. The way I read all of this is, I think this whole thing was like a kind of cocked up political scam to give Jesus sentence. So the whole thing is kind of going like this, right? So later, when you get ready to sit down and write the history of it, 4 different guys would, of course, have slightly different recollection of how it all worked, depending on where they were and what they saw.
It's a kangaroo court.
Well, yeah, clearly, yeah. Okay. And so this girl, the servant girl at the door, apparently wonders, and what the grammarians argue about is in Greek, it's possible to ask a question where you presuppose the answer will be no, right? So, you're not going to chop off your hand, are you? I assume the answer will be no, and there's a way that I composed the sentence so the grammar would make it clear. It wasn't a real question, right? It's in the form of a question, but it's really a statement. We're agreeing that you're not going to do that, right? And so some people think this sentence is such a sentence where the girl is saying to Peter, expecting him to say no. You're not a disciple, are you? But I don't think so either. I think that the better commentators say no. In this particular construction with the context and everything, she has a speculation that perhaps he is, right?
Okay.
Yeah. And she's not sure maybe what answer she's expecting, but it's a real question.
だからこれは女の人の質問は本当の質問であっただろうと思います。はっきりですなんて知らなかった。
Yeah, I think, well, also like Japanese, I mean, when you want to be polite, you always make the sentence longer.
Yeah,
and it's the same way stuff.
It's like that. I think your Japanese insight is good. I think it's like that. I mean, she's being intentionally fake here. Because she could have been clear if she wanted to be.
Right.
And some translations, if you shop around for translations, make it clear for her. But anyway. The key point, though, and all that's just like doesn't really matter, because the key point is that Peter's denied being a disciple.
大切なことはともあれペテロが否定したということが大切なんですね。その言い方云々ではなく。
And then verse 18 says that the servants and officers had made, and by the way, in John's account, Peter's first denial happened at an earlier stage than it seems like it happened. But it's always 3 times in it. Now the servants and officers had made a charcoal fire because it was cold and they were standing and warming themselves. Peter also was with them, standing and warming himself. This charcoal fire seems like a small detail that not everyone would remember, but actually both Mark and Luke rather prominently remember that there was a charcoal fire. So for some reason it burned its image into the brains of 2 of the guys who were remembering this story, that there was a charcoal fire. And I checked, all 4 of the Gospels clearly remember that Peter's denial happened at night. All right, so it's the same night between the time they spent together in the room and the conclusion of Jesus' prayer, out to Gethsemane, although they didn't all call it Gethsemane, but out to the Mount of Olives, back towards the high priest's house. But the denial by Peter all 3 times in every one of the 4 Gospels happened at night. The appearance before Pilate happens in the morning of the next day. And in one of the accounts also, the appearance before Caiaphas happens in the morning of the next day also. I think I want to stop on time always possible, so if you had any question or comment, please stay after, but let me pray so in case people need to go home. Dear God, for most of us, we've been hearing these stories for our whole life. And different parts of the stories may stick in our mind. We may remember the stories of Jesus in the garden, praying that if it were possible that this cup could pass from him, because we need to understand that Jesus was really a man who really didn't want to give up his life. It was hard for him to give up his life to atone for our sin. And we thank you that the Bible helps us to see that he was really a human being like we are, who really paid a personal price to save our life. And also, Lord, we see when we pick up John's Gospel as we're reading now, a reminder that our Lord Jesus was not only a man as we are, but also God, with all of the divine power and attributes of you, O Lord. And then it becomes even more amazing because we understand that the price that he paid on Calvary was not necessary in any way for him, that he did it willingly by setting aside all of his power and all of his dignity to die on the cross for us. These mysteries are so difficult, Lord, for us to fully appreciate your character and the wonderful things that you do. We're so thankful that we have the Bible to read. We're so thankful that we have Christian fellowship like this to gather together in so we can read together and discuss your glory. And we ask you always, Lord, to please help us to remember the parts that we've understood correctly and the ways that bring you glory and honor, and that you would work on our understanding even while we're sleeping and not paying attention, that our understanding of you would get deeper as the years go by. But also, Lord, in a class like this where we have fun talking and discussing and joking, which I think for the most part is okay with you, if we ever say things that aren't true or we don't treat the word with right respect or whatever, please forgive us and please help us to quickly forget any mistakes in our thinking. Our objective, Lord, is to know you better and to love you better and to obey you better. And nothing else. Please help everybody here to get home safely tonight. Please help Steve's knee to heal. Please help Insuk to recover from her trip back from her mother's funeral. And I know, Lord, that so many people here have so many things in their lives that they need your help with, and I know that you're aware of all of them. Please bless us, Lord, and help us. And if it's your will, please help us to come back again here next Tuesday, where we'll continue reading about your glory. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.